So I'm actually going to change the order, if you all don't mind, so that Dr. Brown has an opportunity to answer a question that I think Dr. Saeed posed really succinctly, which is there a fiqh position more appropriate for North America? If I could just read through some of the other questions that we have for you, but I do want to keep that in mind because I think that was an excellent bridge to what Dr. Brown is going to be discussing. So for Dr. Brown, we posed several questions. One is, what textual or architectural evidence is there for inclusion of women in the main prayer halls of mosques during the Prophet ﷺ's life and the generations immediately following? Please discuss the rise and history of the balcony space, the separate rooms for women in mosques that we see today, and what, if any, are the prophetic precedents for these developments, or are there none? Please also discuss the concept of fitna as it applies to gender relations and explain how and why fitna might be cited as the primary reason for women's marginalization in or exclusion from the mosques. What were the most prevalent legal viewpoints on women's mosque attendance in the earliest period of Islamic history? And what does prophetic tradition tell us about the Prophet's understanding of fitna, or temptation, and women in the mosque? Broadly speaking, what are the social, religious, and political factors that have led to the marginalization or exclusion of women in mosques? So with that, I'll leave the floor to Dr. Brown.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I was going to read off my phone, but now I have this stuff in front of me so I can have my computer. Doesn't look that bad. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to contribute to this discussion. A couple of points. The first is that this notion of fitna means strife or temptation, sort of strife and temptation. It's certainly one of the biggest components in the discussion about men and women interacting in Islamic tradition. And it certainly is in the issue of what mosque access for women. It's sort of like it's like a gas. It'll expand to take up as much space as it can, this notion of fitna. So this tends to happen in Islam, in certain Muslim communities, is, if you say, okay, men and women are a fitna for each other, well, you could just go and say they should never be around each other ever. So, I mean, that's the sort of, and you get to the point, some people will actually argue that. So, what we see from the life of the Prophet and from the Islamic scholarship, as Muslim scholars try and figure out how to understand what God wants from us in every time and space, is that's generally not allowed to happen, right? So there's other values that also compete with this kind of gaseous expansion of fitna, namely that women actually do have a right to mosque access, they have a right to education, they have the right to engage in commerce, they have the right to be in the public space. And so it's really a question of how do you find the right balance between these two issues. The statement the Prophet said, alayhi salatu salam, that I've not left after me a fitna more dangerous for men than women, I think the way we understand that is really based on how we approach it. You could look at that as this is a sexist statement, and some Muslims have kind of treated it as this kind of maxim, this universal maxim that almost treats women like existentially a threat to stability. But I think the more accurate way to look at it is really, it's like a lot of the Prophet's sayings, it's a very specific statement made to convey a specific message. In this case, it's actually, I think, extremely good advice to men, which is that women are a source of temptation for you. And if you're a man who is, let's say, in public office, let's say you're a congressman, and you have the choice about whether you're going to take pictures of yourself naked and send them to women, you maybe should not do that as opposed to doing it. So this is actually very good advice, I think, that a lot of men should keep in mind. I think it's the way we approach this statement is kind of determines whether we think of it as a sexist statement or as one that's good advice for men in general. So those are just two statements I wanted to make at the beginning. There are a couple of overarching framework, sort of to create a framework for this discussion. There's a couple of overarching principles in Islamic thought. One is in Islamic scholarship, there's tremendous conservatism in worship. which is totally appropriate, right? The reason why Muslims all around the world basically pray in the same way is because Islamic tradition has been extremely conservative about how we innovate in worship. The basic principle in Islamic thought is you are forbidden to do any innovation in how you worship unless there is specific evidence from the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet that you can do something. So when you look at if you think of a mosque as a space for worship, it's very suitable and it's very appropriate Islamically that there be tremendous conservatism. Here I don't mean conservatism in the sense of, being serious and scowling and not wanting to shake. I don't mean that. I mean conservatism in not wanting to change things, not wanting to alter things. So the Prophet instructed us very clearly in authenticated hadiths that the men pray in the front, and then the youths pray behind them, and the women pray behind them. The best row to be in if you're a man is the front row. The best row to be in if you're a woman is the very back row. This is established, okay? And I think I personally don't have a problem with that. I think, the example of the mosque visit by the mayor of New York is very interesting. I don't know, this seems like a real tragedy that this happened. But, I think there's this kind of, we feel a lot of this pull in America towards just a totally integrated space, almost like let's say, a Episcopalian church, where you go into the service and men and women are sitting next to each other. Muslims in America are not ethically obliged to become Episcopalians. Okay, if someone said the mayor is going to visit the locker room at the gym, we wouldn't be surprised if they were men in one locker room and women in the other locker room. So in America, we accept that there are some spaces, some activities where men and women are separated from one another. It's just historically, at least in the recent modern history in the United States, worship hasn't been one of those spaces. For Muslims, it is one of those spaces, at least at the moment of worship. And what I mean is men and women do not stand together in the same row. Men and women are separated physically in the act of prayer. Now, mosques are and have always been about much more than prayer, and I think that's one of the problems, right? Which is that why was the mayor taken into the prayer space? Why wasn't the mayor taken into, like a lot of mosques, I don't know what the mosque looked like, but almost every mosque I go to in this country has a lobby, and there's almost like a gymnasium room, and there's a little lecture area. I mean, there's so many. What? Not in your city. So I mean, I think that this is one of the problems, is that we need to really think about the different functions that mosques serve. They're not all just about a prayer. I mean, yes, the prayer space should be segregated to a certain degree. I don't think one can argue about that in a way that has any authentic grounding in the Islamic scriptures. But that doesn't mean that men and women don't interact in the mosque, and it doesn't mean that there can't be spaces in and around the mosque that aren't integrated. So, for example, one of the many functions that mosques serve in Islamic history at various times and places is they were the courts, like in early Kufa and the city of Kufa in the 700s, 800s. The courts were held in the mosques. Now, one of the things is that women who are menstruating can't go into the mosque. So what would they do? They'd hold the court at the door of the mosque. So people would be able to come, even if you're not Muslim, there's no problem. The litigants would come, and the judge would be sitting sort of out in front of the mosque, and the case would be held there. So there's all sorts of ways that these spaces were manipulated to fulfill the different functions that Muslims needed. So first, overall conservatism in Islamic worship. Second, there's this overall principle in Islamic legal thought, which is, as I mentioned, this kind of gaseous function of fitna, that it kind of expands to fill space. What that meant is if you look in a lot of Muslim legal books from the early Middle Ages, early modern period, up until today, you'll see the idea that women should not leave the house except for, you'll see it expressed in different ways, necessity, legitimate reasons, et cetera, et cetera. First, this is really only talking about upper class women. Second, this is highly culturally influenced. I mean, extremely culturally influenced. Because if you look at it, it's very, very different from the way that women lived at the time of the Prophet, which is the ultimate source that Muslims have. So how do you go from one state of affair where, let's say during the time of the Prophet, women were not only in the mosque, not separated from men, but again, not sitting amongst the men, sitting behind the men, where women would get up. The case of during the caliphate of the second caliph, Omar ibn al-Khattab, he's giving a sermon, and a woman gets up in the middle of the sermon and corrects him for something he's saying. This is a reliable hadith. I mean, nobody would get up in the middle of a sermon, even a man today, and correct the khatib. But this is a woman got up, and he didn't do it. He didn't get upset at her. He actually changed his opinion based on her correction. So how do you go from that sort of state of affairs to one in which women are told they're not allowed to go to the mosque? They're not really even supposed to be in public unless there's a legitimate reason. And so the reason for that is this kind of gaseous expansion of the concept of fitna. Finally, is the last kind of overarching principle that the reasons that Muslim women today have to be in public and to be in the mosque are totally legitimate reasons. They're reasons that Muslim scholars would consider legitimate, even in the past. Things like education, things like commerce, things like praying in the mosque. These are totally legitimate reasons that all Muslim scholars acknowledged give women the right to be in public space, even for conservative Muslim scholars. So a lot of times, Muslims know that men and women aren't supposed to shake hands. Even in the Hanbali School of Law, which is people always think is a very conservative school of law, if you're a woman who's, let's say, in the classical Muslim scholars would have considered her kind of a lower class woman, i.e. not rich. Actually, she has to go into the street and buy things and sell things. She doesn't sit at home and have servants do this for her. Then she's even actually allowed to not only speak to men, but also she's allowed to shake hands with men. Because this is just part of, you have to be able to do this in daily transactions. Like, for example, if I'm handing something to a woman and she has to grab it from me and our hands touch and things like that, this is accepted. So there's a strong class bias in classical Muslim scholarship that women who are out on the street and out and about, actually, they have a right to do that because it's necessary for them. Nowadays, I mean, unless you're extremely rich in the United States, you don't have servants to go do stuff for you. Everybody in the United States is basically, from the perspective of classical Muslim scholars, lower class, right? We're all going out every day and buying stuff and doing. And so that's really the rung of legal rulings we should look at. And if you look at almost every school of law, the legal rulings for someone who's a servant or a slave or out and about, lower class, they're much more flexible than someone who's wealthy. So a wealthy woman wasn't even supposed to go to court for her own cases. She would have a representative go on her behalf. A lower class woman was allowed to go to court. Only 2 minutes. How long have we been talking for? Okay, I was like, sort of Doctor Who time warp or something. Okay. One of the other speakers will talk about the main hadith evidence, but I just want to, the main governor in this issue from Scripture is the Prophet saying, do not prevent the female servants of God from going to the mosques of God. Very simple. And the most reliable version of this hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, it says, one of the wives of Omar ibn al-Khattab's son tells a story. One of the wives of my father, Omar, used to go and pray the morning prayer and the night prayer in the mosque with the men, i.e. in the mosque with everybody. Someone asked her, why do you go there? And she said, different versions. One says, my husband could prohibit me if he wanted, he doesn't. But the Prophet said, do not prevent the female servants of God from going to the mosque of God. So here we have not only an example of the practice during the time of the Prophet, we also have the Prophet's statement that you can't prevent women from going to the mosque. But what's the other thing that kind of acts to constrain that permission is the statement of the Prophet's wife, Aisha, who is a huge legal authority in her own right, that if the Prophet had seen the condition of women today, and remember, she's saying this just maybe a decade or so after his death, if he had seen the condition of women today, he would not have permitted them to go to the mosque. So when you look at the Islamic schools of law, what you see is, and I don't want to go through each school of law, but what we basically see is there's a strong argument for general permissibility of women going to the mosque. And then there's you'll start seeing that constrained a little bit by concern over fitna. So let's say in the Maliki School of Law, there's a strong argument that women who are older, I guess it was before the cougar phenomenon or something, women who are older, maybe not so attractive or something like that, maybe they passed their child-rearing years, they can go to the mosque, that's fine. Young, nubile women shouldn't go to the mosque. So you can see the kind of concept of fitna being used and that's really what Aisha's statement is saying. She's basically saying things have changed today. Women are, let's say, less modest, or men are less control, or society is less stable. We're not exactly sure. Then basically you just go across to the farthest extreme of the spectrum, which is the Hanafi School of Law after the 12th century, which is basically the school of law of South Asians, who also the South Asian tradition has a, let's just say, strong strand of misogyny in it. I think that's a fair statement. It's funny, people always think Arabs are misogynists. Arabs aren't misogynists, okay? I don't think so, okay? I think if you want to look at really, really historically very, very strong misogyny, the South Asian tradition is much deeper in that regard. I can make an argument for that, but I think if you look in the Hanafi School of Law, especially in South Asia, is you get the blanket prohibition on women going to mosques. Basically, women do not go to the mosque. Because what those scholars will argue is that the Prophet's statement that women do not prevent the female servants of God from going to the mosque of God, that was an exceptional statement for his time only. It was a license given to the women of his time only. What's the general rule? The general rule is Aisha's opinion, and the desire or the aim of prohibiting fitna. Is that clear? So you go from the Prophet's opinion being the principle that is then restricted to being the exception, and the restriction is the principle. I think it's a very ironic argument, because and I'm a fairly conservative Muslim myself, so I don't like to engage in conservative bashing or anything like that. But if you, for example, on issues of inheritance, Muslims have inheritance law that's sometimes controversial because of gender disparities. Someone will say, oh, well, we need to change that because this was, based on the society at the time of the Prophet. Now things are different. And a more conservative argument would be, you don't have the right to change specific statements made by God and the Prophet because you think society has changed. But actually, on the case of women's mosque access, the conservative argument is doing exactly that. It's actually saying, the Prophet just meant that for his time. It's Aisha's statement and our concern for fitna that is governing. Now, so basically, when it comes to the legal arguments, you see there's a tremendous range, and I believe the strongest legal argument with the strongest scriptural foundation is the permissibility of women going to the mosque with certain restrictions. For example, in some of the versions of the hadith, it says they shouldn't wear perfume when they go to the mosque. So there's men and women shouldn't be in the mosque flirting with each other. We could probably all agree with that. Whether or not you want to say, let's say in the Shafi school, women who are really attractive shouldn't go to the mosque. Also in the Hanbali school, I personally am a Hanbali. Women who are really attractive shouldn't be going to the mosque. I don't know how you're going to go and I don't know how you do that. Get some committee, I'm not sure. Some of these rulings are difficult to...
But you have other opinion inside the Hanbali school, like a brother.
What?
Inside the Hanbali school, women can lead the prayer too.
Yeah, they can, but yes, that's true. So, but I mean, the point is that there's understandable concern. I think I wouldn't want to go to a mosque and see people, flirting and texting with each other or something. I don't know. I guess maybe they would text even in person these days. I'm not sure. So let's just look at very quickly, some of the history and archaeology or architecture of how mosques function. Here, again, you have tremendous diversity. I would basically say that whatever the option you can think of, some Muslim community was using that in the past. And it was done so legitimately with the approval of religious scholars. For example, during the time of the Prophet, the mosque was very small. Women would pray at the back. There was a special entrance for the women. during the time of the Caliph al-Mahdi, who's the second Abbasid Caliph, so you're basically talking about 770s, 780s of the Common Era, he actually expands the Prophet's mosque and builds a whole area, what was called Saqa'if an-Nisa, the arcades of the women. So they're actually kind of a roofed area put in specifically for the women in the back. But it's not clear. It wasn't a space that was cut off. It was just kind of a set of arcades at the back that were covering the women up. Cordoba, the famous city of Cordoba, which was the capital of Umayyad Spain until it was conquered by Christians in 1236, there's a women's arcade area. There was also an ablution fountain in the courtyard that was specifically for women. So one of the fountains in the courtyard was just for women. The city of Kairouan in what's now Tunisia, in the 11th century, there's an interesting debate that happens. The mosque was getting so crowded that the men's lines and the women's lines were actually kind of connecting. And if anyone's ever been to Mecca, this sometimes will happen, because when the time for prayer happens during Hajj, I mean, the whole city just turns into a big mosque. And so you can be stuck behind 50 Nigerian women or something like that. And then there's, 100 Indonesian women who happen to be next to you, and you can't get out, you can't move, right? So this is basically what was happening in the mosque. And what they did is they said, okay, we'll just build a barrier between the men and women. So I think when we use the word barrier, we have to be very specific. When we say barrier, do you mean women are totally barred off from seeing the imam or seeing what's happening? Or do we say that there's a place in the mosque where men and women would otherwise be in communication with each other or contact? We're basically creating maybe a wooden barrier or one of those Japanese screen barriers or something, anything you want, just so that men and women aren't praying exactly next to each other. In Fez in the 1500s, we know that there was a upper balcony built for women in the Kairouan mosque there. And that wasn't just for them to pray, it was also for them to listen to lessons. This is something that we have to keep in mind, which is that mosque isn't just for prayer, it's also for education. And that there seems to have been a general acceptance. For example, the famous Shafi scholar of Damascus, Abu Sham al-Maqdisi in the 13th century, the famous preacher and scholar of Baghdad, Ibn al-Jawzi, who died in 1201 of the Common Era, they both talked about how in study sessions and preaching sessions, men and women would both be in the mosques, the big mosques of Baghdad and the big mosque of Damascus, and there should just be a division between them. And one of the things they criticized was when men and women started chit-chatting with each other, okay? And by the way, a lot of times these concerns were brought by women because, they would be trying to talk and some guy would come up behind them and basically start feeling them up or something. There's acknowledgement that men and women should both have access to the mosque also as a study space to learn from the scholars who are teaching there, but that there should also be the division honored. Okay, thanks very much.